Siomra Beag.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Tiny Room. Welcome back to On Digital Siomra Beag. I am the Michael of Michaelandbenjaminspodcast, and I am joined by the man who has been called the Nicole Scherzinger of Siomra Beag. It's Benjamin.
Hi. I bet
Yeah.
you wish your podcast host was hot like me.
Oh, that's very good. That's not where I was
yeah.
going. I was going with, Ben, that you are the talented one who is inevitably going to have a solo career.
Oh, that's very sweet, Michael.
Yeah, it was a nice one this week.
Quarantine is he does that every once in a while, ladies and gentlemen, so that I get lulled into a false sense of security, and the next one it just smacks just a little bit harder. Oh, it just hurts.
Exactly, Ben. Exactly, Benj. And
Yeah,
like
terrible.
Nicole Scherzinger and the other sexy L ones, I am essentially your glorified backing dancer.
Yeah, but like, to be fair,
Yeah.
most of the teenage boys' eyes are on you.
Yeah. I don't think teenage boys care much for the Pussycat Dolls, Ben. They're all in their 40s.
They might have at one point, though.
I think they're more into Little Mix.
I think
I've been
Little Mix
watching a
is
lot of
gone now as
YouTube
well.
lately. I don't know where this is going. Look, Benjamin, I do apologise. I've gone off topic almost instantly. Benjamin, hearken, listen, Benjamin. Do you hear but a presence which approaches? I'm doing.
Yes,
a thing.
I believe it's fully approached here, Michael.
Yeah, no, I'm doing a thing, Ben. It's a setup. Benjamin.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, Benjamin. We look across the misty moor and see a figure coming out of the darkness. And as the figure approaches, Ben, it coalesces. And it coalesces into our very special guest this week, Benjamin. It's Dr. Stephen J. Cadwell.
What ho! Hello, it is me.
Look, that introduction will make sense later.
Hello.
That's one of Michael's classic little teasers for what's coming up in the episode, ladies and gentlemen. But hearken and listen.
Yes.
There upon the moor, following that coalesced figure is
Theme music for the podcast. We don't actually have any theme music.
Oh, it was the theme music. Very good.
theme music.
Very good. Hello, Stephen. We should probably give you a little introduction to the guests. No, you're the guest. To the listeners. It can be sometimes difficult hosting a podcast, I have to say. Stephen, this is Benjamin. This is a good friend of ours, good friend of the podcast, Stephen J. Cadwell, long-time listener, first time on the podcast person.
Yeah. First time speaker back to. Normally, when I speak back to you, it's just to myself. You know, on the street saying, "No, Ben, it's not pronounced like that," or something.
Very good. So that's really the reason we've brought you in today, because you are an expert on pronunciation of foreign terms.
Yeah, that's mainly.
You're just going to keep an eye on Ben and keep a watch over his pronunciation of names and phrases.
Because quite frankly, it's poor.
Exactly. Benjamin, why don't we bloody get a move on here?
Yeah, fair enough. Michael.
Hello.
Stephen.
And Stephen. Yes.
Yes, hello.
There's been some bloody news this week.
Oh, how exciting.
I know. Well, there's different things that have happened, Michael. Finally, Michael.
Yes.
Michael. I know you've been waiting. And I know you've been tweeting at Dan Harmon nonstop. I know you've been there going, first of all, Dan, I want my Szechuan sauce. Second of all, Dan, where's the other 5?
Yeah.
Okay.
Also, Dan, you're a real Jerry, and I'm a real Rick.
I'm a real Rick, because Ricks would definitely care. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Rick and Morty returned last Sunday. And it was with a rather bizarre episode. You know the way every season Rick and Morty seems to have an episode where it just gives a middle finger to the fandom? Where it's just like, fuck you.
No, I know what a middle finger means, but I don't...
Love.
What episodes would that be, Ben? Just very briefly.
There's bloody Interdimensional Cable 2.
Right.
There's bloody what other ones do we have? There's bloody alternate Ricks. There's all these different things, and every once in a while, Michael.
Yeah.
The creators just seem to have enough. Well, this episode 6 of the new season is that very episode. Basically, Rick and Morty get trapped on the story train. And the story train is a bizarre thing that looks at tropes from stories, and it's run by the story master.
Oh, Ben, I bet you like that.
I did. Oh, tropes galore, Michael. And more importantly, a little undermining of those tropes to importantly
you love
highlight
that.
the flaws in certain plot structures.
It
It was delicious. But anyway, they get trapped on a train, a trope train, if you will. And basically, everyone who's trapped on that train keeps telling a Rick story as if he's some kind of mythical, kind of everyman creature. A little bit like Mad Max Fury Road, where Mad Max is just kind of a stand-in for the actual character. But it gets pretty interesting, and it gets super meta, Michael. Oh my God. Oh my God.
Ben, I
gets
can
so
hear
meta.
your lips smacking with glee.
Yeah. So, basically, what happens is, we're led to believe, Michael, that we're going to get another Evil Morty episode.
Yeah.
And that gets kind of snapped out of existence very, very quickly. Goes, that can't be canon, Morty. And he has this whole thing. And so basically, we're looking at lots of the different vignettes that we see in the opening credits. And it turns out those are all an illusion created by the story master to fuck with Rick. And so basically, it's just saying, ooh, is this canon, fanboy? Is it? Am I going to keep this? Are you ever going to get to see the conclusion to that arc? Nope.
Yeah.
It's pretty weird stuff. It's called the I can't remember. It's the never-ending Rick, as in the never-ending story.
Yeah. I've heard of it.
It's a whole thing. Look, if you're into Rick and Morty, it's there. If you're into meta things, it's also there. Wasn't one of their best. It gets very sloppy and hard to follow at one point.
Oh, but that's good, Ben. That's meta in itself.
That's meta in itself, I suppose. The crux of it, Michael, and if you
go
haven't
on.
seen it yet, a little bit of a spoiler here. The crux of it is that Jesus Christ saves Rick and Morty.
Oh, good.
They turn to the Lord.
Yeah. It's interesting that you've chosen the word crux there.
Because of crucifixion.
Yeah, how meta-referential of you, Benjamin.
Oh, look at me. Nailing it across the board. Moving on to things that all three of us care about, Michael.
Yes.
Bloody great news.
Go on.
Great news. You know one of my favorite things about The Mandalorian Season 1, Michael?
It's the baby Yoda, the little small Yoda.
No, it was the attractive, strong woman who played his partner.
Oh, really Gina Carano.
Yeah.
She's from the UFC, remember, Ben? She did that lip-biting gif. I showed it to you. You had to have a sit down.
Yeah, no, I believe that was the first time. I believe that was the first time I had to take a cold shower in your house, Michael.
Yeah.
But no, my second favorite thing about The Mandalorian was the bloody Deathbot voiced by Taika Waititi.
Oh, yes.
And apparently, Michael, that was just his way of buttering up the Disney execs because Taika Waititi's directing the next Star Wars movie.
Didn't he direct that episode?
He did, and it was very good.
Yeah. He's good at directing, that guy.
He's good. Some would say he's excellent. Some would say. So I'm pretty excited. Taika Waititi's version of Star Wars. I hope it's Thor Ragnarok with an 80s soundtrack that doesn't make any sense in that world.
Well, look, Benjamin, as you know, no great Star Wars fan am I. No great Star Wars fan. I mean, I enjoy Star Wars. Let's throw it over to our guest here, Dr. Stephen J. Cadwell, and see what he thinks of having a wacky Taika Waititi Star Wars.
I'm over the moon. I think it's going to be the best thing ever. I'm trying to phrase this correctly. Big Star Wars fan, am I?
Yeah, I mean, there's no real opposite, is there?
Yeah.
No.
It's a tough one. I ended up sounding like grown-up Yoda.
Yeah. Or as he's also known, Yoda.
Yeah. I think it's going to be brilliant. Like I'm a big fan of Taika Waititi stuff with Flight of the Conchords and the kind of the kind of DIY stuff that they did when they had lower budgets, and particularly I loved the TV series of What We Do in the Shadows, and the New Zealand series Wellington Paranormal is probably my favourite TV series of the last few years, and he's been involved with all of those, and of course Jermaine Clement. So I'm very excited to see what he'll do with Star Wars. The rumor that I've heard and I'd be very, very excited about is that they might do a droids story, and for the kind of the people who are Star Wars. No, how do I say this? The big Star Wars fans, are they listening? Yeah. The
pretty good
Star Wars fans. It might be similar to or based on the droids storyline that was in Clone Wars, which I think was like season 5 or season 6. And there was a whole story arc that was following a group of droids on a mission. And if he did something like that, I think it would be incredible. And again, just like you say, Thor Ragnarok was such a good movie. It'd be great to see what he can do with it.
And if it's a droid story, then one of them will probably be going beep beep boop boop.
yeah. And then conveniently, other characters will repeat what he said.
Exactly.
Using indirect speech, which is always useful.
What do you mean the Imperials
helpful.
are closing in?
Yeah.
Beep beep boop boop boop.
Yeah.
Maybe Taika Waititi will hear this and cast me as the beep beep boop robot.
I hope so. That'd be excellent. I'd
That'd
I'd like to be friends with the guy who was the bibbidi boop droid in Taika Waititi movie. I'd be into
That'd be pretty good.
I think
That
he's
would
got
be my droid
think-
name. My droid name would be BBBD Boop.
Nice, pretty good.
Or MK Lee O would be another one.
Yeah, we could
That's
do
pretty
that.
good. I don't know if it's as representative of my characteristics now as BBBD Boop.
I think that might nail it on the head. So that's
Benjamin,
one-
what other Star Wars news is there on this week's Star Wars podcast?
So that's a little bit of new Star Wars, Michael. And then for the more hardcore, older, great Star Wars fans out there, there's some really great news coming. Now, I'm going to get this wrong, so Stephen, be ready. I'm going to need a correction.
That would be his droid name, Stephen B. Ready.
Stephen, be ready. Nailed it. Temeura Morrison, the original Boba Fett, is
That's
returning
completely
to
wrong,
the...
Ben.
No, not the...
You were saying it wrong
damn it.
before the podcast. You were saying it wrong before the podcast, but now you've got it much more wrong.
Isn't Temeura a liquor that you drink?
Yeah.
Like
Well, I think one of the twins from the Two Twins show.
Liquor Morrison.
What's the Two Twins show called, Ben? With the twins, you know the one I'm talking about? Sister, yeah.
Sister.
I think that's who you're thinking of.
Tia Mowry is returning Tia Mowry is returning as Boba Fett in the Star Wars universe.
I mean,
it's great news all around.
It's good that characters aren't defined by their gender anymore, so that's great.
I mean, it's great news for social progress, for Star Wars progress. It's wonderful news. But there is also a rumor going around that the man who lent his visual likeness to the entire Clone Wars saga and gave his face to Jango Fett and the Clone War troopers is returning to play Boba Fett in The Mandalorian Season 2.
Oh.
To lend his face yet again. Season 2, because let's be honest, Michael, you couldn't have another entire series about a Mandalorian without some form of Boba Fett coming in.
I don't know. I think they probably could have.
Yeah, I think it would be okay. Like if in the Clone Wars, Boba Fett's, a little boy, and like he's a kind of a good character in it. But they really flesh out the whole Mandalorian world and their kind of culture so much more. And obviously, I'm not a big enough Star Wars fan to know what's canon and what's not canon between in the Filoni-verse. Yeah, I think they could do a really good job without bringing Boba Fett in, because there's enough storyline there.
Yeah,
It does diminish their main character a little bit, doesn't it, by having the more famous guy who looks like him show up?
Yeah. True. And like I was watching the original trilogy with my daughter, and watching the Jabba scenes that on Disney Plus with the remade, the reissues. And they keep unnecessarily cutting to Boba Fett, excuse me. They keep unnecessarily cutting to Boba Fett just to show him more, because in the real original trilogy, he was only in it like for maybe 2 or 3 shots.
Yeah, and barely in it.
Yeah, and it's just because of the action figure, and because he looked like a Spartan and he had a jetpack and he could shoot flames. Like that's why, kind of boys and girls of my generation, being, probably the oldest person to ever appear on your podcast, we all loved him back in the 80s because he had a jetpack and he looked a little bit like enough like a Lego figure that you could kind of play with him and be him in the playground. I think that's why we love Boba Fett. It's not because of his he's the original clone or whatever. I don't think I think kind of let him die.
Yeah, leave him alone.
Leave him in the Sarlacc.
I thought they did let him die.
Yeah,
in the Sarlacc.
he's being digested for 1,000 years. So That's a shout out to the Star Wars fans there who.
Yeah, that's a Star Wars reference. It's like beans or chewing gum.
Just takes a long time.
Yeah.
Gets stuck in the digestive tract.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's how you kill a sarlacc. You just feed it with chewing gum, and it gets stuck in its digestive tract for 15,000 years, and then it can't poop.
And then boom! I mean, it's a
That's my best.
15,000-year kill. But,
That's my best Star Wars joke, Ben. That's the best I have.
it's the best you
It's
got.
not getting better than that.
I kind of agree with you there, Stephen, on the thing. I think Pedro Pascal carries that show pretty well as one of the most interesting Mandalorian characters I've ever seen. Apart from the Smith, who's just amazing. She's just such an interesting character. But yeah, I think it could be a misstep to bring him into this. I'm assuming they might bring him in as a proper antagonist. Who tries to hunt down the kid. I don't know if they're gonna. I would assume that would be the most useful role for him.
Well, I mean, if they send Boba Fett to get the kid, he's not going to do it. He's never successfully caught someone.
Well, he's caught Han Solo for 5 minutes.
Yeah, for a couple of minutes.
He was more or less given Han Solo, and then just kind of
Yeah. Well, he hid Slave One among the rubbish, and that was like a big. Sorry, I'm being too Star Wars nerdy here. I'll stop.
That's very Star Warsy.
You're too Star Wars nerdy for this nerd podcast where we talk about, among other things, Star Wars.
Anyway.
Yeah, speaking of other things, Ben.
That's going to be pretty interesting. But Michael, do you remember the ship they used in Star Wars to cross the desert to get to the Sarlacc pit?
Kind of land ship thing.
The land ship, Michael. Yeah. Well, Michael, those were largely inspired by sea ships.
Oh, very good, Ben. This is why I do the segues now, in fairness. This is, leave that to me now, in fairness, Ben. So, Benjamin, have you ever heard of the organisation called Fish Éireann?
That's very, very. Is that Television Ireland?
Well, that would be Telefish.
Oh, this is TV Éireann, is it?
No, Fish, Ben. Screen Ireland.
Oh, right. Okay.
Screen Ireland, Ben. You know, every country has their kind of Screen this country that produces the arts.
Yeah.
Screen Denmark.
Kiwi Vision.
Screen Belgium.
Yeah.
Anyway, look, Ben. Screen Ireland produced a film, Ben.
A film?
An honest-to-God feature film. Do you remember those?
Yeah, back in the day.
Yeah,
Jesus.
yeah. A new feature film, Ben. A very big rarity. And it was officially released late last year, but it has become on video on demand over the last couple of weeks. So it's on Google Plus. It's among other things, Ben, and it's a mostly Irish but also Belgian and UK production called Sea Fever.
Sea Fever. Okay.
No, not Sea Fever, Ben. Sea Fever.
So, Michael, tell me a little bit about Sea Fever.
Very good, Ben. Sea Fever, Ben, is a classic haunted ship horror story.
Ooh.
Yeah, but not ghosts. It's not ghosts, Ben. It's science. This time science is out to get you. But
science is the enemy.
It's one of my favorite genres, Ben. It's the haunted, small location, creepy, evil place. The only way it could have been better for me is if it was a spaceship rather than a sea ship.
It's unfortunate they couldn't do that for you.
Exactly, the sons of bitches. So Ben, it's directed and written by an Irish director called Nessa Hartigan, I think.
Okay.
She's a lady.
A lady?
Yeah, she's a lady director. Benjamin, you will be somewhat disappointed to learn she directed one episode of 2017's The Inhumans.
Oh no, Nessa.
We'll forgive her that. Well, let's assume it was the best episode.
Okay, because she's Irish.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. And it is this film, Sea Fever, is the story of a young scientist, and she's also a lady, Ben. So there's
there are two ladies,
lady scientists and lady directors. It's a very modern world. And she goes on a sailing ship. No, not a sailing ship, Ben. A fishing trawler. As part of a science research, and the fishing trawler encounters something bad.
A sarlacc pit.
Essentially, it's actually very similar to a sarlacc pit. Now that you mention it,
never mind.
It's a big tentacly sea monster thing.
What?
And one of the things that the big tentacly sea monster thing can do is infect people with its parasitic offspring,
Oh no!
and that makes them go a bit wibbly wobbly, and then unpleasant things happen to them.
Ugh.
Yeah, but yeah,
I
it's
hate
good.
parasites.
Yeah, I know
hate
you do.
parasites.
You really won't like this. Squiggly things wriggling around in people's eyeballs and stuff.
No, Michael,
Yeah. And it gets in through the
No.
blood, Ben. It gets in through the blood.
No,
No.
I don't like it.
And
I don't like it. My skin's crawling.
it's quite, as far as horror films go, it's quite small scale. It's 5 or 6 people on a fishing boat. That's it. That's your cast. That's your story. There's no world-ending consequences. It's just 5 or 6 people on a fishing boat with parasites.
Ugh.
But-
Ugh. But
One of the really interesting and exciting things about it is it has some of the best Irishmen in space you're ever likely to see.
probably because they're not in space.
Well, they're not in space; they're at sea. But Irishmen in space, Ben, as you know, is our catch-all term for Irish people in science fiction, fantasy, horror,
It is.
and anything like that. So, the captain of the ship, Ben, is played by noted not Irishman Dougray Scott.
Get out of town. Noted
Yeah,
not Irishman
yeah.
Dougray Scott.
Yeah, or as he's also known, almost Wolverine.
Oh, yeah.
Remember that? But
Yeah.
he plays it as he's from the west of Ireland.
Oh.
And
Uh-oh.
where in the west of Ireland is not entirely clear.
Okay.
It's somewhere between Cork and Galway. And I'm not saying Limerick. It's just, I'm not saying geographically between Cork and Galway. It's just sometimes he appears to be from Galway and sometimes he appears to be from Cork. But it's one of the better Irish accents I've heard from a not Irish person
That's pretty solid.
doing an Irish accent.
I'm going to have to watch this now. Bloody creepy, crawly things and all.
Yeah. It's very good. It's very good. And the lead actress, Ben, she plays a young Irish female scientist. Scientistess?
No, just
that-
scientist, Michael.
Is that what
Just-
you would say?
Just no, that is what I would say before I was
Yeah.
forced to attend the mandatory seminar on equality in the workplace.
Yeah, it's very good. You know, there's only 3 people who work for this company, Ben.
I know you still made me go.
We just asked
You
you.
still made me go.
What was I saying? Yes, so the lady scientist, her name is Siobhan, and she's
Okay.
a lovely red-haired lady.
Ooh.
And she's a very attractive lady, actually.
I'm
just
sure she
by the
is.
by. But she's a very convincing Irish person to the extent that I assumed she was Irish. And then I looked her up on the internet, and her bloody name is Hermione.
Get out of town.
Her actual real-life name is Hermione, which
No,
I
it's
thought was
not.
a fake made-up name for Harry Potter, but apparently it isn't.
Unless she was named after the character
I
in
don't-
Harry Potter.
I don't think so. I think that's a real name. But anyway, she's as English as the day is long. So
she
she
did a
gets
pretty
even
good job.
more. She gets even more credit than Dougray Scott for being a convincing Irish person, I suppose.
Good for her.
Yeah, it's a very good film, Ben. It's probably my favourite at-sea horror ever.
Really? Just
Ever?
of the
Yeah.
plethora of at-sea horrors that exist.
There are a lot of at-sea horrors, Ben. I know you're being facetious there, but
was.
there are a lot of at-sea horrors.
Well, that's
The
good
Sphere, The Abyss,
Oh, I forgot about all them.
Ghost
that
ship.
one with Ghost Ship with Famke Janssen.
Famke Janssen. Now, there, gentlemen. Yeah.
No, that's not the tone of this podcast, Ben.
Yeah. Famke Janssen.
Oh God.
Is it based on the famous poem?
No.
Oh.
No.
Okay.
No, it's not at all. No.
Ah.
It's based on the fact that some of the people that when people die, they're like, well, it must have been the sea fever that got them.
Oh, no, okay, all right. There's just a really famous poem about going down to the depths of the bottom of the ocean and not
Yeah,
liking
yeah.
what you find.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that is basically the theme of it. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So you enjoyed it, Michael?
It's very good. There is some mild spoilers. The girl scientist lady. What was the word you were using earlier, Ben?
Scientist.
Yeah, the scientist.
Scientist.
She is very. She's a scientist written from the perspective of someone who doesn't really understand science, unfortunately.
Oh, no.
So she insists on. Well, I don't know. The character that she plays insists on quarantining them, despite the fact that there's a known method of transfer of the parasites. They know how you get the parasites.
Okay.
but she treats it like it's this mysterious illness that they have to quarantine themselves from and won't let them contact the Coast Guard or anything because it could spread to the whole world. So it's a very kind of post-COVID thing.
Oh. How
Even though
topical.
that doesn't make sense for parasites, because you know how parasites transfer. And a lot of her decision-making is based on that. And it makes her a bit of a dumb character by the end, unfortunately. And that is my biggest criticism of it.
As a recovering scientist yourself, Michael.
As a former scientist myself, as a scientist in remission,
Okay.
it's a bit upsetting to see that. But, you know, you could say that that's not a fault of the writing. That is the character being a dumbass. But she's not presented as a dumbass. She's presented as the hero of the piece.
But a bit of a dumbass by the end.
Yeah. Anyway, it's good.
Anyway,
Watch it.
it's good.
Support your
Irishman
local Screen Ireland thing.
Not actual Irishman's spouse.
There are some Irish people in it. The supporting
Yeah.
cast are largely Irish.
Oh, good for them.
Or Syrian. It's good. It's good. It's
Sorry,
very good.
what?
It's,
Sorry,
so
what?
Irish or Syrian, yeah.
Why Syrian?
Because there's Syrian guys who work on the boat, Ben.
Oh, okay. I feel like that's a commentary of some sort. I'm not quite sure what kind of commentary it is. Interesting.
It's that people can work on a boat if they want.
Okay, fair enough. Michael,
Yes?
why is Dr. Stephen J. Cadwell here?
You invited him.
Oh, yeah.
Hi.
Yeah, that was it. Hi. No, Michael,
Yeah?
this week,
Yeah?
we'll be taking a look at Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
Yay.
But- Yay! And Dr. Stephen J. Cadwell,
Yes?
currently to your right, to your left,
No, he's on
from
my
my
left
side,
Yeah.
is going to is basically the one of the three of us
Yes.
who actually knows what he's talking about when it comes to Dungeons and Dragons.
Well, then what the hell is he doing here?
What the hell is he doing on this podcast? Look, we made a mistake, ladies and gentlemen. We invited someone who knows what they're talking about in the podcast, which is pretty much the end of the podcast. We've broken the conceit. It's all over. But anyway, Stephen, you are here because you actually know what you're talking about. So thank you very much for doing this.
It's my absolute pleasure.
And this particular idea was sent in to us by a listener of the podcast, Connor Dunn. And Connor's out there in listening land, and he gave us this idea. So we decided to run with it and take a look at it. So what we'll be taking a look at is Dungeons and Dragons, what's it all about?
Yeah.
Dungeons and Dragons,
Yeah.
where did that lull come from? Dungeons and Dragons, whoa,
Yeah.
where did that resurgence come from? And Dungeons
All right.
and Dragons everywhere.
Yeah.
Is what we'll be taking a look at. So,
Is that what
that's
this
kind
episode is called?
of Dungeons and Dragons everywhere?
Yeah.
Yeah, nice.
Okay, good.
Nice. I like it. But basically, we're going to be taking a look at what has given it its longevity. What's really made it stick around for quite so long, and why does it cross-mediate quite so much? So, yeah. Would you like to begin, Michael, or will I begin?
Well, I mean, the big question that I have on my mind, and this is really aimed both at you, Ben, but also at Dr. Stephen Cadwell, is what even is Dungeons and Dragons anyway?
Well, Dr. Stephen J. Cadwell, would you like to take this one, or will I?
I can take it, and you can just call me Stephen if you want.
Nope.
Yeah, no, that's...
Nope.
We don't do that in our real life, so we're not going to do that on the podcast.
Nope. You've earned that title. You
Okay.
can have it.
Thank you. Thank you.
You've earned
Yeah.
that title.
Dungeons and Dragons is probably the most popular role-playing game system in existence. It's probably the most famous. It's certainly, whenever you talk about what they call pen and paper role-playing or tabletop role-playing, this is usually what would come to mind. I'd say this might anger Mick, but I'd say it might even be more famous than Warhammer.
My brand loyalty.
But I don't know. Certainly, I'd say maybe in the States it's more famous, but perhaps here in this part of the world, Dungeons and Dragons might have a bit of a Warhammer might be a bit more famous. But it's the idea is that it's a role playing game, which is basically a kind of a cross between a board game and improv in the the kind of the comedy and the theater style. And what it was kind of, I won't say it was invented or created, but I'll say it was kind of evolved, or it was intentionally evolved in the late 70s by a team of war gamers who wanted to kind of find a more immersive way of playing wargaming. And the most famous among them was Gary Gygax, who for years has been kind of considered the inventor or the creator of Dungeons and Dragons. But as the last 30 years or 40 years have gone, it's become clear that he was certainly a key figure, but by no means the only person. He didn't just invent it himself, just to kind of establish that the game itself was born out of playing and interaction, which makes sense because the game is all about playing and interaction. It's not about one person making decisions. It's about a group mediating how things progress together. And so it's quite interesting that that's how it started. But it's basically the idea is it's set in a kind of a medieval world, and that has elves and orcs and dwarves and your typical kind of Tolkien-esque characters. And then each of these characters, each of these races has different attributes, so they have different strengths and weaknesses. And then within each character, you have different classes, so you have different kind of careers. And so what you...
Like scientist.
Yeah, exactly. So a scientist would probably map over to something like a mage or a druid class in D&D, and it's basically, the idea is that when you're playing, you have your what we call the dungeon master or the games master, who's the person who is essentially acting as God or acting as the rule book, and they kind of lead the group. And then you have a group of 1 to as many as you want, people who play heroes, who play the kind of the dungeoneers, if you will, and they get to pick different races and different classes in the character creation, and then they, using dice and a set of rules, they determine how strong or how weak they are in different areas. And then everybody forms a team and they progress on a mission. And originally the missions always were dungeon jumping missions where you kind of hack and slash your way through a dungeon until you get to a dragon at the end. And the yeah,
that's where the name comes from.
That's where the name came from. Yeah. And you kind of proceed to the end until you face the dragon, and then the monsters that you face get harder and harder, or the creatures, I should say, the creatures that you face get harder and harder as you progress until you reach the dragon, who should hopefully kill off 1 or 2 of your team, and then someone lives at the end, and they come away with lots of money. And yeah, so it's all about, basically, the game is all about pretending to be a fantasy creature, then killing as many monsters as you can and amassing as much wealth as you can. And the more you do this, the better you do this, the more points you increase, the more things you can buy, and the better your character becomes. So it's basically the prototype for all the RPG computer games that we know nowadays, like the Final Fantasy and Skyrim, of course, and all the Elder Scrolls. They would have all taken this mechanic and kind of run with it. So that's basically my little mini history of D&D.
Can you be a character who's good at doing a flip?
Yes, you can.
Oh, good.
The great thing about Dungeons and Dragons, and the great thing about almost all role-playing games, is that you can be whatever you want.
All right.
You can within reason, you can be anything you want. So yeah, you can be an acrobatic character. All you do is you roll a dice and you'll get a little number, and then you'll write it on your sheet beside acrobatics, so as that then when you're faced with an issue and you say, well, you say to your dungeon master, well, I want to do a flip, you'll get bonus points on your dice when you roll the dice. You'll do a flip, and so it'll be easier for you to do a flip, whereas the crotchety old dwarf that I'll be playing wouldn't be able to do a flip.
So if there was like a pit, I could say, I would like to do a flip over the pit.
Yes, but all the D&D fans now listening to this podcast will say, no, Mick, please don't do a flip, because they know how bad falling damage is in Dungeons and Dragons. And
but I'd be really good at doing a flip, I'd imagine.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So yes, you definitely can flip over the pit.
Okay. I don't know where this is going, but I hope in the future I get to play a character who can do a good flip. I'd like to be an accountant who's good at flipping. Benjamin?
Yes?
Do you want to steer us in a direction here, rather than me just talking about doing a flip?
Yeah, fair enough. So Michael...
Could I have a character who he approaches the dinner table, and rather than sitting down normally, he does a flip onto his chair, like over the back?
Yeah. Well,
good. All right.
You roll the dice, and it's up to the dice. You leave it in the lap of the gods.
I like this. Yeah, I like where this is going.
So basically, anyway, this has been huge in popularity, especially throughout the 70s and 80s, and has spawned countless games, as Dr. Stephen J. Cadwell said. And I suppose where a lot of people who wouldn't normally be into that kind of thing might have heard about this is, and don't hate me for this, Michael, but Stranger Things.
Oh yeah,
Stranger Things seems to have reintroduced the concept of Dungeons and Dragons to quite a few people, even going so far as to name its main antagonists after characters from the D&D game. And really, a lot of the characters, monsters, classes, and things like that we see have become central tropes in all swords and sandals fantasy fiction.
What do you mean they've named their central characters after D&D characters? Like 11 is named after the number 11 written on the dice.
I said they're antagonists first of all.
Oh, they're antagonists. Okay, I
said they're antagonists.
I don't know if you did say that.
I did.
All right, fair enough then.
Because I wrote it down specifically because I said
fair enough,
Mick
then.
will call me up on that. The Mind Flayer and the Demogorgon are there are two monstrous antagonists.
Will is a roll. Will is a
There you go. See.
You have to roll Will against the magic spell. That's
See, Ben?
Nick,
They just took out the sheet and they said 11, Will, roll, the character roll.
Famous Stranger Things character Sheriff Roll.
I'm looking forward to meeting Sheriff Dexterity next year. That'll be
in season 4. But anyway,
if I could be really,
it has also spawned.
If I can.
Oh,
I was just going to say, if I could be really nerdy, there's a lot of discussion among the D&D fan base about Stranger Things, because obviously it's brilliant. Stranger Things is incredible, and they do a really good job of representing the kind of the emotional ties that can develop when you play a game. But if you want to be really nerdy about it, there is some questions about the game system that they use, because a lot of the references are to games that didn't exist when Dungeons and Dragons was set. But that's just if you want to be really, really nerdy. But I think Stranger Things is incredible. So
being really, really nerdy is exactly why we had you on the podcast, Stephen. So that's perfect information for us. Perfect information for us. So to get a little bit more onto Mick's point. It has spawned spin-offs. It has attempted other media. It is, I suppose, it's the go-to nerdy activity, isn't it, for any kind of TV show, any kind of information that you could put. Like when you really want to mark a character out as nerdy, they play D&D.
Although, as Dr. Stephen J. Cadwell said earlier, in British things, they use Warhammer to show a character's nerdy. I don't know if you remember, there's a very famous episode of Peep Show where Mark is at his most humiliated and he says, "This is the most humiliating thing I've had to do since I cancelled my subscription to White Dwarf."
Yeah, so much in the same way that it works there for English television, Dungeons and Dragons is the go-to way to brand your character as a nerd. They're someone who enjoys Dungeons and Dragons. There is nothing nerdier in the American pop culture psyche than Dungeons and Dragons. And yet that hasn't at all slowed its popularity or kind of slowed its growth, and you can find
If
it.
anything, it's sped it up, Ben.
If anything, it's caused a bit of a boom in it, because you can find it in most media now. We, Michael, before attempting this podcast today, divvied up the D&D responsibilities for the week. So basically, we have our expert, who is Dr. Stephen J. Cadwell.
Hello.
We have, and then you and I drew the short straws, and I got to read the comic books, and you had to watch the bloody movies. And look, I think it's fair to say, Michael, we'll never be the same. And perhaps, certainly in the case of the comics, maybe it'd just be better left, on a tabletop somewhere.
I see what you're saying.
But let's get into it a little bit.
Get into it there for 5 minutes, Ben.
So there have been numerous attempts to bring Dungeons and Dragons to the comic book format. One of them was by DC Comics many, many moons ago in the mid 80s. They released a series called Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. They somehow got the rights to it, and they created this
Probably
kind of
money.
mini. Yes, it would have been money. They got this mini run, and they tried to introduce the dynamics to the comic book where in one run of it, you could actually choose what happened to the character within the comic. It was really weird. They tried to do a choose your own adventure thing, copying the mechanics. It flopped, obviously. And then finding other material about it in a comic book form was quite difficult until IDW got the rights in 2010.
Oh.
And they started releasing numerous runs and volumes based around the lore and mythology of the Dungeons and Dragons universe. The first one they released was a run called Fells 5. And it's a classic D&D Dungeons and Dragons campaign. You're introduced to 5 characters in a party. Those 5 characters interact with the world. It lasted 16 issues. I'll be honest, it wasn't great, Michael, from my reading. The art was kind of slapped together here and there. Character development was pretty poor. They seemed to try.
Did anyone do a flip?
Nobody did a flip, Michael. So you're out
What
automatically.
poor character development.
You're out automatically. But luckily, Michael, they kind of started to push a little bit more and realize that they couldn't just coast by on monsters and characters that we might have known from the campaigns, and they started to actually flesh them out a bit. And what we got instead was, we ran through a couple of different things. So you can leave out Fells 5. That's not particularly interesting. I urge you beyond all belief to stay the hell away from Dark Sun, which came out in 2011, which follows 2 guys. One is a Conan substitute, and the other is a Jaskier substitute from The Witcher. So think Conan the Barbarian with a Jaskier kind of bard.
Okay, that sounds good.
They just run around. It's awful. Don't read it. The art is terrible. But then they begin a run based on Baldur's Gate, which is a city in the Dungeons and Dragons universe.
Right.
And Stephen, you might be able to help me out with this a little bit more. But there's a character in it called Minisk the Beloved Ranger.
Meniscus.
No, not Meniscus.
The injured knee.
Meniscus the injured knee. No, it's not that.
How'd he hurt his knee, Ben? How'd he hurt his knee?
In a campaign, Michael.
Yeah, but what was he doing, Ben?
He was doing a flip.
He was trying to do a flip.
And
but he failed his role.
Anyway, and this is where
he tore his meniscus.
This is where
That's
IDW.
what happened to me, Ben.
This is where IDW really found its stride with these comics, and they introduced us to 5 new characters, and
I'm writing that down, Ben.
They've been a roaring success ever since.
It's going to be my character when we inevitably play Dungeons and Dragons. Meniscus of the torn knee. Where are we going here?
You write that down, and that introduced us to Minisk, the Beloved Ranger. It introduces to Denican and Delina, who are 2 elven twins, and it introduces us to the rogues, Crydal and Shandy. Like, the names aren't great, let's be honest, but these characters have found huge popularity as a run, and they keep getting runs back, and it's all based under the title of Baldur's Gate. So you have Baldur's Gate, Evil at the Gates, Baldur's Gate, Shadows of the Vampire, etc., etc., etc. And they've become really popular characters. So I actually really enjoyed those and strongly recommend that you read them. They're quite enjoyable characters. It's well written. The art is a lot of fun. It changes a lot, but it's still good. However, Michael, then...
Yeah.
I had to deal with the Forgotten Realms.
Oh,
And
I didn't think you'd done it, Ben.
ooh-wee.
Ben.
Ooh-wee.
Ben, I didn't think you'd done it.
I don't.
I thought you'd forgotten.
Oh.
Some of the best jokes, really.
Yeah, so I'm going to leave the podcast, ladies and gentlemen.
Yay!
Dr. Stephen J. Cadwell and Mick are going to take over because I just can't do this anymore. I find myself increasingly staring into the abyss here, ladies and gentlemen. Just kidding. So anyway, the Forgotten Realms seems to be a very popular run in the D&D community.
Okay. Ben, I'm just going to interrupt you for a second, if
Go
you
on.
don't mind.
Go on.
Because I'm going to throw back to Dr. Stephen J. Cadwell a second ago. Because you said something a second ago, and I've always wondered this, but not wondered enough to check myself. But now that I have someone I can ask, we can just ask him.
Go ahead.
Stephen,
Yes.
when Ben says Baldur's Gate
Yes.
is a city in the D&D universe,
Yes.
is there a D&D universe?
Yes and no. So the D&D universe is called the Forgotten Realms.
Okay.
So Forgotten Realms is the kind of if you imagine D&D is the hardware, Forgotten Realms is the software. So it's the content. Forgotten Realms refers to the gods, the mythology, the cartography, all the kind of the content that you would read about and learn about if you buy official D&D campaigns.
Right.
So Baldur's Gate would then be a part of Forgotten Realms, but I've never read the comics. Now I'll be openly honest about that. So I guess what they did was they called a certain series after Baldur's Gate Forgotten Realms, because a lot of listeners might know that the Baldur's Gate games, the RPG games that you can get on PC, are considered to be one of the best electronic versions of D&D. So you have the Baldur's Gate series on as PC games, and then you have the Baldur's Gate comics, which I didn't know about up until now, and then I think all of that would kind of exist within the Forgotten Realms universe.
But then, if I'm understanding you correctly, Forgotten Realms is a setting.
Yeah.
But you could play Dungeons and Dragons and create your own universe.
Yeah, so I haven't played a Forgotten Realms game in years because I'm opening myself up now to a Twitter storm, but I'm not on.
Good.
I'm not on Twitter, so it's okay.
Yes. This will be the controversy that launches the podcast. This will be it.
Yes, an old man in Dublin doesn't really care for Forgotten Realms. No, I don't really play Forgotten Realms. I don't really like it. I find it's kind of derivative of Tolkien, and it's very interesting in a way, and I like to hear people talk about it, but I really don't care about what happens to the characters in Forgotten Realms and the mythology and storyline. As Mick says, I much prefer to kind of create my own or modify my own, which is probably a better way of saying it.
Well, Dr. Stephen J. Cadwell, how would one go about that? Explain that a little bit more, because that sounds pretty interesting.
So the idea is that it's the first set of rules that were kind of cobbled together back in the late 70s, which was what was called Dungeons and Dragons, or the basic system. They're basically a series of tables, and all these little actions and events are written down on the tables, and you use them to kind of, you roll a dice, or you use them to decide what you're going to do, what your characters are going to do. And that worked quite well. And then in the 80s, they brought out Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and all the systems were reviewed and kind of kept being reviewed by different groups of people. And at the time, it was run through a magazine, which I think was called The Dragon, or I can't remember. I can't remember the name
Dungeon.
of it might have been The Dungeon. I can't remember. But so you'd kind of send in your ideas to the magazine, and only probably 50 people would read the magazine, and then that would be they decide, oh, that's a good idea, let's put that in the next release. And so this kind of kept going all the way up until system dungeon, or kind of D&D 3 or D&D 3.5, So if you're when we're talking about Dungeons and Dragons, really what we're talking about as a system is D&D 3.5. That's usually what people know. So it's on the one that's out now, which I would really recommend if anybody wants to get into it, is to go into any local game shop, not Amazon, please. Go into a local game shop and buy
when it reopens.
When it reopens, yes, or order online and they can deliver it to you. But any local shop would be more than happy to sell you D&D 5.0, which is very, very good. It's a very, very good introduction to role-playing games. But D&D 3.5, to get back to my long-winded way of explaining this, is the introduction of the D20 system. So what you have is with 3.5 in the year 2003, they released this thing that's called the D20 system, and they made it open source. So anybody can make a game based on the D20 system. Now, a D20 is a dodecahedral, a 20-sided dice. So a 20-sided die, that's what D20 stands for. And this basically became the core mechanism that many role-playing games use. All D&D since then have used. But the idea is that you use the D20 system and the specific set of dice to create your own games. So you no longer have to have Dungeons and Dragons games that you've bought that are set in the Forgotten Realms. And so this has actually been going on as long as Dungeons and Dragons has existed, and it's often referred to as homebrewing. And it's where you take a system and you make your own game. And so I'm turning 40 next month, and so I was playing most of this in my first games was like 92 to 98, maybe 97. I probably stopped when I was about 17 or 8. No, actually I lie. Probably up to about 2000. And I think I got a girlfriend around then and stopped playing for a little while. And then,
congratulations. Let's have a quick check with Ben. Ben, how old were you in 1992?
In 1992, I was 1.
Yeah.
1 year old.
So, 1 year old. Oh, Jesus. So when Ben, the adult man, was 1, I was playing Dungeons and Dragons, but you could only really buy them in the Virgin Megastore because this was before the internet. Can
I make an awful joke at your expense?
Yeah, there is a certain bit of irony there.
Yes, the Virgins in the Virgin shop. Yes. Thank you. But they were like £40. So you couldn't and you had to buy 3 or 4 books. You had to buy the Dungeon Master's Guide, and you had to buy the Player's Handbook, and you had to buy the Bestiary. So what me and my friend Brian did in the 90s was we just kind of made our own, and that's what we did. We just kind of homebrewed our own games based off the systems. And then in 2003, when I was 23 and Mick was 21, and Ben was
21,
11,
9.
I was about 11 or 12, yeah.
Got the maths, yes.
You're so young, Ben. Can I just interrupt very briefly, Ben? Pound was the Irish money we had before the euro.
What? What do you mean before the euro?
It was based on the Great British Pound. It was linked to it when we separated from them in the early 20th century.
What do you mean separated from Great Britain? It stopped happening before I was born. Wait, what?
Oh, yes. Sorry, Stephen, as you were saying there.
But so then, since then, I've been making a lot more homebrewed games and making them smaller. And the way homebrews work is you can basically take the D20 system, which is. Should I talk about how the D20 system actually works, or is that too in depth?
Go for it.
Okay.
No, go for it.
So the way it works is you have 2 sides of every. The way gameplay works is you have 2 sides. You have combat, and then you have oh God, I forgot the name. Role playing. So I'll just call it role playing. But so you have combat and you have role playing, and the way the combat works is like we were saying about Mick's flip.
I'll do a flip.
You'll have picked a character, or you'll have created a character in a kind of a lengthy character creation process. So you'll know your race and your class and your strengths and weaknesses, and these will all be written down on a character guide sheet. So you'll have these all prepared in advance of playing the game. So you'll know what your statistics are. So your strength, your dexterity, your constitution, your intelligence, your perception, etc., etc., etc. You know what all these are. And
can I roll for sexiness?
You can in some games, but they call it appearance, and that actually does come into play a lot. Basically, any attribute of any person or anything that you can think of, you can put into a role-playing game. You can put into the D20 system. So, like, famously, if a character has like 1 in appearance or 0 in appearance, then they have to be. They're going to be really ugly in the when other characters meet them. So when they walk into a shop, the shop owner might say, "Ugh, get out," and then they
get out of here.
Get out. Yeah, exactly, you ugly little goblin. Or if they try to charm a person, the person's going to go, "No, you're hideous. Get away from me." So,
that hit a nerve.
No, but the good thing about doing that is you might have really bad appearance, but then you might have great dexterity. So you might be really ugly, but you'll be super at doing flips. So in the team,
this is getting very personal.
But in the game, then whenever a flip is needed, you're the man. But whenever charm is needed, you don't. You don't come in. But so the way the kind of the role playing works is we all start off in a tavern or something like that, and you just go walk around and you talk. The scene is described by the dungeon master, and you just talk to whoever's there. And if you talk very well, if you talk in following your alignment, so if you're lawful or chaotic or neutral, if you talk like you're supposed to and you're good at improvising, then you get bonus points, you get experience points. And you can use them later on in the campaign to move up levels and to get stronger and stronger and stronger. But then in the combat, you use your stats and your modifiers, and you roll the dice. So there's always an element of luck involved. I guess Mick will know in real life fights, there's luck involved. I'm sure, isn't there? No,
I don't know. I don't know. How much.
Stephen, you've woken the beast.
Don't know if I'm luck, to be honest.
Yeah.
In real life.
So, like, the idea is, sorry, Ben.
It's not your fault. You couldn't have known, Stephen. You couldn't have known.
As you can probably guess, my involvement in fights has always been one-sided. Because I was in a Virgin Megastore reading Dungeons and Dragons and getting beaten up by Mick's friends.
Hey, I'm a nerd. I didn't have any friends.
You should have played D&D.
Yeah, no one invited
you
me.
don't need friends when you've got D&D. That's been my philosophy on life. So the idea is that you have then kind of what they call campaigns and one-shots. So if you play a campaign, which would be where, let's say, the three of us meet once a month or however often, and we keep playing through this long novel-like story. And you can buy them from Dungeons and Dragons or from your local comic shop or game shop, and they'll sell you a big hefty tome, and that'll be a campaign, and that might take you a year or 2 years to run through. But what I would normally play nowadays is what we call one-shots, where you might play them in one setting or 2 or 3 settings, and that's a much shorter, more confined game. So it's not about experience. It's not as much about building up these huge characters. It's more about just trying to play things quickly to try and have a bit of fun and tell an interesting story. And really, that's the basis of all Dungeons and Dragons and all role-playing games, in my opinion, is number 1, have fun. Number 2, tell a really good story. And then maybe number 3, try and get to the end, try and finish it. And number 3 is by far the hardest because people have lives.
If the main point of Dungeons and Dragons is to have fun and tell a good story, then why did they make the movies that I was suffering through this last 2 weeks?
Because I would say they were movies of the Forgotten Realms, which is pants.
Which is pants. Is that your professional?
my professional opinion as a doctor of philosophy and a college lecturer in pop culture is to say Forgotten Realms is pants and come at me, bro.
Come at him.
But only on the tabletop games. Don't
Yeah,
actually
exactly.
Come out in real life. But you get Mick to do a flip on you.
I'll do a flip. I'll do a flip right over their head. They'll throw a punch at me and I'll have done a flip and they'll fall on their face.
Yeah.
And I go, he was surprisingly agile for an ugly guy.
So I can't look at him, but my God, can
Wasn't
he move?
expecting that, to be honest. I thought he was going to be a bit gnarly and noddly, but no, he just did a flip out of nowhere.
It's the most elegant beast I've ever seen.
Exactly.
What were the movies like, Mick? Go on.
No good, Ben.
Yeah.
And I think Dr. Stephen J. Cadwell has kind of explained it very well there, in that the Forgotten Realms is, in a sense, a lot like Warhammer, really. It's a setting, not a story.
Yeah.
Like, if someone asked you, what's the story of Dungeons & Dragons? There isn't one.
No.
The story is what you make. Now, of course, there are supplied stories that you can play along, a story that someone has pre-written for you, but it's a setting. And as a setting where people like to imagine that they live and have adventures in, it does a fine job. Like a Warhammer or a Skyrim or an Elder Scrolls, it's a kind of a bit of a, like, there's a lot of background in it. There's a lot of magical items you can go hunting for and different races you can meet, but there's not a story. And the problem when you try and make a movie about something like that, and it equally applies to Warhammer or if they ever do an Elder Scrolls movie, there's no pre-made story there waiting for you. The story's only going to be as good as the story you write. And the story that they wrote for the movies is not very good. And unlike Dungeons and Dragons, which is, I think, from listening to Dr. Stephen J. Cadwell, quite a personal thing where you have your character and you progress through that character's story. The movie focuses on a kind of grand story of the universe, like super powerful wizards doing fate of the whole world things. It's more, I mean, if the movie was condensed into a 4-page backing document as an explanation for why your band of adventurers are going to this particular dungeon, it would be fine. But you can't make... It's the reason... Warcraft is another good example as well. It's probably the reason the Warcraft movie didn't do very well.
Except with the Chinese.
The Chinese, grand bunch of lads.
Grand bunch of lads.
Well, what they did well in Warcraft, in my opinion, is at least they had the wizards taking time to cast spells. Like, it took the wizards a few minutes to kind of cast a spell, whereas in Dungeons and Dragons there was just nothing. There was just no reference to the actual game at all.
Yeah, that's it. It's nothing to do with the game. Yeah. They've taken one of the weakest things about the game, which is probably the setting.
Yeah.
And they've made the setting into the movie.
Boo.
Now the second one, which is on a much lower budget and nobody saw, is probably, I think, a better Dungeons and Dragons movie. Because it's about a guy gathering a team of 5 specialists and going off and entering a dungeon to try and get a thing.
You son of a bitch, I'm in.
Exactly, yeah. But I mean, they get like a guy who's a roguish guy, and he picks the locks and he sneaks about the place. And they have a warrior lady, and she does the warrioring. They're not all equally good at everything. They all have abilities and talents that they need to get through certain problems.
That sounds much better. I never actually watched the second one because I was so hurt. I was personally hurt by the first one. I refused to give them my money, but that definitely does sound...
The first one is a very strange film. Well, it's what I'm saying is it's a much better... Also, it doesn't have Marlon Wayans in it.
Oh.
Going, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Like a bloody droid.
That was a pretty solid Marlon Wayans impression.
Wayans screaming impression. I watched him screaming for 3 hours, so it's embedded in my brain. The second one, I'm not necessarily saying it's a better movie. It is a better movie because it's more intimate, but it's probably more akin to a Dungeons and Dragons experience, but probably still not as good as just going and doing a Dungeons and Dragons.
Exactly.
Like, why would you want to watch 5 other people doing it when you can just do it?
Well, the thing is, it's actually that's one of the things I would say is the biggest issue with the sorry, I'm trying to plug my laptop in and I just made a huge mistake. Sorry, you might want to take a... I just wrapped my headphones around the charger and...
You failed your role for dexterity. He's going to strangle himself with his cable.
There, now, I'm back. The biggest problem with the adaptations is always that it's, as you say, it's just telling a derivative story of kind of a low-level Tolkien without actually capturing any of the fun or the humor always that you experience when playing a game. But I would say that watching and listening to people play Dungeons and Dragons is something that's become hugely popular with the advent of podcasts, and it's something that really got me back into it with podcasts that are what they call actual play podcasts. So for me, it was Nerd Poker by Brian Posehn was the first one I listened to, but now there's like dozens, if not hundreds, of actual play podcasts where all you're doing is listening to people play, and usually Dungeons and Dragons. But there's lots of other good ones, and they manage to capture the excitement because you're actually hearing the humor and the excitement and the fun of the rolling and the improv. But the movies just had nothing. Or the movie that I saw just had none of the actual game elements, none of the fun, none of the life, none of the jazz of playing D&D, and it was just flat, dull.
There are 2, I think, good adaptations of Dungeons and Dragons to media, and we don't really have time to talk about them, but I'll very briefly. The cartoon from the 1980s, I think, was probably a lot of people's introductions to Dungeons and Dragons, and doing a flip, because there's one of the characters in that who can do a flip, and that's actually still good. It holds up.
Excellent.
We don't have time to get into it now, but the best piece of Dungeons and Dragons media ever put to film is from a couple of years ago. It's a Brazilian Renault Outsider ad, and the whole ad is a live action remake of the 1980s Dungeons and Dragons cartoon.
Excellent.
And it's very short, but they nail the characters, they nail the look, the setting, everything's in Portuguese. It's great. It's absolutely
perfect. Just to wrap us up, lads, very, very quickly, there is going to be a new Dungeons and Dragons movies in 2022.
Oh.
Well, I'm not excited about that.
It has been announced, and former Marvel vice president, something Latcham, Mark Latcham, I think, I'm not sure, is going to be heading it up.
Character.
So it's going to be interesting. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, we're out of time. It's all over. We've run over time, but with so much information, it's a good running over of time. Dr. Stephen J. Cadwell, thank you very, 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 very much for taking time out of your busy, busy Sunday to come and chat to us.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
We really appreciate it. Thank you for listening to us. You're one of the 3 listeners who listens to our podcast, so we're very happy about that. Thanks again to Connor Dunn, who gave us the idea.
Yeah,
ladies
thank
and
you,
gentlemen,
Connor.
Thanks, Connor.
If you have a topic you'd like to hear covered on this podcast, you can get in touch with us in numerous ways. Number 1, we're on the old-fashioned 90s websites of yore at www.seanrebuke.com.
Means tiny room in Irish. Ben, I spend hours every week updating that website, and I mean, your degrading of it every week is starting to
We're
really hit me.
also on the really, really smooth, efficient, young, hip, and Gen Z Instagram platform at Sean Rebuke.
The Gen Zers aren't on Instagram, Ben.
So, well, we haven't got a TikTok channel yet, but don't you worry. I've got some
We haven't
costumes.
got a TikTok because you can't work it.
We're going to be lip syncing to some TikTok tunes soon enough, Michael. We might take a scene from Dungeons and Dragons and lip sync to it.
Yeah. Let's do that.
Because that seems to be all that's required. So, ladies and gentlemen, you can get in touch with us at Sean Rebuke on Instagram as well. If you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts, do give us an L review. If you're listening to us on Spotify, give us an L follow and share us with your friends. And if you're listening to us anywhere else, do let us know. If you listen to us on YouTube, leave us an L comment and subscribe.
Hi, Clive.
Dr. Stephen J. Cadwell, is there anything you'd like to say goodbye?
No, just if people are interested, I would recommend the best thing to do is to gather a bunch of friends or family around a table and give it a try. You don't have to follow all the rules. The main thing is to have fun and to tell a good story. And so don't worry about getting too overwhelmed with settings and modifiers and statistics. Just try and roll a few dice, have a bit of fun, and tell a fun story. And that's what I would recommend. And if you're interested in Dungeons and Dragons, go to your local comic book shop or game shop and buy the 5th edition. But there's millions of other cool RPGs that you can get for free online. So that's another way to do it now in the COVID-19 days. Yeah.
Great. That's a lovely wholesome note to end on. Ladies and gentlemen, that's it from us. Bye.
Bye. See you next week.
Bye.
Nice.
Stop recording.